It's inspired by hope, surprised by hope, surprised by hope. I apologize, I didn't get the questions printed off for y'all this week, but I'm going to follow along the book, or someone can follow along in the book and read the questions to us. They're just to prompt discussion. They just sort of get the wheels rolling, so I don't think they're really necessary to everyone have two copies of it and all that stuff we did last week. Anyway, so we'll begin with a word of prayer, then we'll watch the video from Mr. Wright, or Reverend Wright, and carry on. Okay. Does anyone like to open in some prayer? Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us here together this morning, on this beautiful morning, and keeping us safe. You know the concerns we have about ourselves, our congregation, our community, and our nation. Please help us to open our minds to know that we can change to improve our ministry for you. Help us to focus and show our appreciation to Mike and Jodan for their work this week. We ask this in thy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And big shout out to Cheryl for finding the remote control. You would have loved to have had this last December, right?
Awesome.
Fascinating things about Escombe Church here is that it's much closer in date to the time of Jesus himself than it is to our day. It was built within 700 years of the time of Jesus, and we are now 1400 more years out beyond that. But it isn't just that. We're surrounded here by old tombstones from several different periods, and a lot of them have got inscriptions which actually tell you what people believed about life after death and what hope there might be. So there's one inscription here which has a nice little poem which actually expresses the classic Christian hope. It says, "Go home, dear friends, and leave us here, and let us lay till Christ appear. When Christ appears, we hope to have a joyful rising from the grave." Now that is the mainstream Christian hope. We're resting here at the moment. This isn't the end of the story. Jesus is going to return, and when he returns, there will be a resurrection. All these graves, like in all English churchyards, they're all facing east, so that it was assumed that Jesus would rise like the sun in the east, and then they would all stand up to greet him when he arrived. That is the classic Christian hope. But for many, for the last 150 years or so, the hope has been transformed into something quite different. It's just about, for many people now, going to heaven when you die. No mention of resting and then something else. No mention of a bodily resurrection. Just an abandoning of this world and a flying off somewhere else. And indeed, in this very churchyard, there are some of the graves which tell it like that. So many people are confused about this that it's really important we study it carefully. And that's what this session is going to be all about. So what exactly happened to Jesus 3 days after he was executed? Why did the early Christians use that strange word resurrection when they wanted to say what they thought had happened? And what can we say about our view of what they were thinking? To answer those quite interesting questions, I found it helpful to go back and track a bit through what people in the first century believed about what happened to people after they died. You can divide those views broadly into two, ancient pagan views and ancient Jewish views. The ancient pagans had a whole range of things they believed. After all, some of the Roman emperors believed that when they died, they were going to become gods and their female family goddesses. But there were many other views as well. Some ancient pagans just believed that when you died, that was it, that was the end. You find on some ancient tombstones a little Latin tag which basically means, once upon a time I wasn't, once I was, now I'm not, and I don't care. That was quite a common view in those days, but there were others who took a more cheerful view that your body would die and decay, but that your soul would go somewhere really nice and pleasant and live there for a long time. Or others of them believed that your soul would rest a while and then would come back into a different body. You would turn into somebody else, and so on and so on. There are lots of variations on those beliefs. The Jewish people had less variety, but still some. Some of them seem to have believed that death really was the end. Some of them seem to have believed that the soul would go off somewhere else. But interestingly, leading up to the period of the time of Jesus, a significant number of Jewish people really did believe that one day, not instantly, but that one day, God would raise from the dead all his people, perhaps even the whole human race, but certainly all his people or all his righteous people. And when they used that resurrection idea, they didn't mean a soul going off into the blue yonder. They meant somebody being raised from the dead physically, so that they were really themselves again, perhaps even more so. So we have to ask the question, not only why did the early Christians say that that's what happened to Jesus, but interestingly, what did they think would happen to them and to all people sooner or later? This is particularly striking because across many cultures, including contemporary cultures, the things that people believe about life after death, the things they say about that, somebody's funeral for instance, tend to be very conservative. You tend to say pretty much what people said to you when you were young, because it's a time, a very solemn time, for sticking with what you know and where the tradition has left you. But fascinatingly, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence right across the first 100 and 200 years of Christianity, they all said that what was going to happen was resurrection. In other words, they went for one option and only one option out of that whole range of ancient pagan and Jewish worldviews. So it's a question that the historian has to ask. Why did they all change their minds and go for this one? They had other options. Why did they plump for this and only this? Of course, their answer was, the reason we're going this route is that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. So we have to go back and look at the stories they told about what had happened. And when we go back to the books we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, we find that each of them tells the story of the first Easter day in some significantly different ways. And that's fascinating because, you know, if they'd got together 40 or 50 years later and said, it's time we actually wrote up a story that'll convince people, they wouldn't have done it like that. They'd have cobbled it together and made sure that all the details matched exactly. But the stories don't look like that. They look more like what you'd get if there was an extraordinary event, a road accident or a plane crash or something, and everyone in the breathless hours after that happened telling it like they'd seen it, often with bits and pieces of details upside down and inside out. That's a bit how the Gospels read at that point. But there are other odd things about those stories which make me as a historian think that they really have the ring of this is how they told it at the beginning. For instance, very interestingly, the women, Jesus' followers who were women, play a very significant and striking role in all of them. The men are away hiding somewhere. Jesus' male followers thought that the authorities were going to come after them as well, but the women were the first at the tomb and they were the first to go and tell people. Now, feminists among us may think, well, isn't that great, fine, and pass on. But it's more interesting than that, because in the first century world, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. In other words, again, if you were making up these stories 5 weeks or 50 years later, you would never have invented women as your primary witnesses. But there they are, front and centre in the stories. Something very strange is going on here. In addition, the portrait of Jesus in those resurrection stories is fascinating, because in some of the Jewish speculations about resurrection, They seem to be saying that people will come back exactly as they were before, no change, back into the same body, the same sort of physical life, and you'll just have it all over again. Whereas others among the people who speculate about resurrection seem to be saying that when we're raised, we'll be like stars in the heaven, we'll be shining like heavenly bodies. Interestingly, in the stories in the Gospels, neither of those is true. Obviously, Jesus is not shining like a star. They would have said that if that had been how it was. He appears, to begin with, as somebody just like them, and he eats and he drinks with them, and he can be touched. But then there are very strange things that happen as well, because sometimes he appears and disappears, and sometimes they don't know quite what's going on. Is he really there? They thought he was a ghost, and then it turns out he isn't after all. And again, I have to say, if they'd been making up stories later in order to say, there you are, he's really physical after all, they wouldn't have done it like this. One of the leading scholars of our day, who is not himself actually a practicing Christian, has put it like this: it looks as if they were trying to say something for which they knew they didn't have very good language. In other words, something new is going on here. What was it, this new thing? Well, we can track back historically and say that the only way that they would have told stories like that was if two particular things had happened. On the one hand, there must really have been an empty tomb which they knew was Jesus' tomb. And on the other hand, there must have been meetings with someone, sightings of someone who they took to be Jesus himself. If you didn't have the first, they would have said that those sightings were just hallucinations. They knew as much about hallucinations as we do. If you didn't have the second, they would have said, oh, well, the tomb has been robbed. Tomb robbery was quite common in the ancient world, particularly of well-known people, because robbers would hope that there might be jewels or other valuable goods in the grave with them. It really does look as though the tomb was empty and there were real meetings with Jesus. And you can go through all the options, all the skeptical accounts of, oh, well, it must have been like this or that or the other. But actually, I and many others have done that. And the answer is no, they don't work. They don't explain the rise of the early Christian faith. The only way to explain it is to say that Jesus hadn't just been resuscitated back into the same life. He had done something quite new. He had gone, as it were, through death and out the other side with a new sort of body, of which there had been no previous example, and of which to this day there remains no subsequent instance. Now the skeptic will say, well, that's utterly ridiculous, and the early Christians knew then that it was indeed ridiculous, and many people said that. But actually they discovered that what they said about their experience of meeting Jesus and knowing him to be alive somehow began to change everything. And they discovered that resurrection wasn't just something that happened to Jesus. Resurrection meant that God's new creation had begun. The new world had already started, not with a great bang and suddenly everything being transformed overnight, but with this one prototypical event which was going to generate and drive a whole new world. And you can see that they believe that in the way that they tell the stories. In John's Gospel, in chapter 20, when he is describing what happened on that very first Easter day, he reminds us that it was the first day of the week. And a little bit later in the chapter, he says it's the first day of the week. And you might think, well, what's so special about that? And the answer is John has written his gospel very carefully, in such a way as to remind us of the great sequence in the book of Genesis, the great sequence of creation. And he's now saying, this is a new creation. This is the first day of the new week. Because the point that he's making, as they all do, is that the story doesn't go like this. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, therefore that's all right, we get to go to heaven. No, resurrection is about a new bodily life in this world and for this world. What they are saying is that the resurrection of Jesus means that God's new creation has begun, and therefore we have a job to do. Our calling then, in the light of Easter, is to be, as it were, advanced foretastes of that new creation. That is to say, we are to be in ourselves both the beneficiaries of it and the agents of it. What exactly does that mean? It means to begin with that the power which was launched at Easter was like a great explosion of God's new power in the whole world. That power is to transform our lives. That's what happens when somebody discovers that the message of Jesus seems to be bubbling up inside them and making them think and feel and behave differently. But it's never just something for ourselves. Jesus spoke earlier in John's Gospel about the living water which he would give. But he didn't just say, I'll give you the living water for you. He says that you are to be somebody out of whom that living water will flow. And for somebody living in the Middle East then or now, living water is pretty important. If you're in the desert, you need that water. You need fresh water to drink, to be refreshed, to stop from starving and getting totally overheated. Our lives are to be like that. God's intention is to flood the dry and dusty creation with his new life. And we are to be people through whom that happens. And that can be through the gifts that God has given us, of maybe creativity, of artistic work, through the passion that God gives us to make justice happen in his world. It can be through the tenderness and kindness that we find bubbling up within ourselves to go and look after people who badly need it. And so often in our world, there are plenty of people very close at hand who come into that category. One way or another, we are to be, as I said, not only the beneficiaries for ourselves of that new creation, we are to be people through whom it happens out there in God's world.
Is that all?
Yes. Sorry.
That's all, yeah.
My back is sore. I've been lifting lumber this week, trying to clear up. So I'm a little slow. So first reactions, anything that just sort of jumped out at y'all? We talked about death and resurrection and life to come and heaven and those things that we all ponder at some point. Sometimes more often than others, but some moments in life we really dwell on it. But just sort of first reactions. What do y'all think? What was that?
Very good.
Okay, very good. I like him. Okay. I like the churches and all that stuff that he's in. We were in England last year, a summer ago, and then I've been to Scotland and England before. They do have all these beautiful little stone churches with little graveyards. I mean, they're everywhere. Every little village has a little church looks just like that or something like that. It's very, I liked it.
I think it would be very inspirational to be and see the effect that it has on you being there. That time way back.
To see things that are that old? Yes. I mentioned last week, I think it was last week, the island of Iona. Or maybe it was the week before. They've all blurred together, I'm sorry. I think it was last week. The island of Iona, which has the monastery that was rebuilt during World War I. It's continually being rebuilt. They're still working on it. It's not completely done. But there's a cemetery there, there's a little graveyard there, and the gravestones are so old that they're just completely smooth. They're, some of them are 600 or 700 years old. And they're right there on the coast, overlooking, it does sort of put life in perspective. Everything here is so relatively new, compared to what we see there. We see something that's 200 years old, we think it's ancient, and they live in houses over there that are 200 years old. And that's not considered a very big deal. It's just a very different world. Not a different world, but it's just, they have an older history than we do here. Okay, so there are a couple of different views that we talked about, that he talked about. There were pagan views, and they varied, sort of depending on what sort of belief system you were following. Some believe, you're here, you live, you die, you're gone. That's all there is to it. You come from the earth, you return to the earth, and that's that. There's no afterlife of any sort. Some believed in, going on to nirvana or some form of heaven and, living on as an eternal soul. I think it's Plato proposed the idea of having an eternal soul disembodied from your physical body. And
Mike, I like the option
Goddess?
where they died and came back as gods and goddesses.
Yeah,
That
I
would
mean,
be
if
my
I can
choice.
check mark that one, that would be great, right? You know, can I get that option? And then there were some who, like the ancient Jews, believed that there was eventually some sort of a resurrection, but that belief sort of varied. Now, my whole life I've heard, as a Christian, from Christians, from family, from preachers, from theology that I've read, variations on that. All of those almost. I've known Christians who believe that this is, the life you have is the life that you have right now. And what's to come may or may not be what we dream it to be. I've known some who do believe that you breathe your last here, you breathe your first in heaven with God. And then I've also, been told, especially when I was younger, that more that classical view of a bodily, physical, spiritual resurrection when Christ comes again in the world. And I remember being explained to when I was very young. That's why, graves face the east in cemeteries, and that's, what we have to look forward to. But between now and between your death and between that moment when Christ returns, there is a resting period. Is there one, what do y'all sort of hold on to? Yes, Sherry.
Mine just says absent from the presence of the Lord.
Okay.
So I tend to believe the spirit goes directly with the Lord. Body stays in the grave until resurrection and we get the Lord. That's
Yes, Sherry.
I believe, Lord, that He comes, and we're all raised. But I have great respect and understanding for those who believe, that it's an instant thing. I think of Christ on the cross, and he speaks to the prisoner in his lap.
Right.
And he says, today you will be with me in paradise or whatever. And that's instantaneous.
Yes.
The way I reconcile the two is I think about when I go to sleep, from the moment I go to sleep until the moment I wake up is an instant.
Yeah.
And so that's how I see my eternal rest, that it will be like an instant.
It will feel like I just woke up refreshed, right? Yeah. And that I think that's a really good way to sort of maybe approach it. What's to come, I don't know, because I've not been on the other side yet, and I don't know what's to come, beyond this life, beyond this experience. But I do, hope and believe that it's something like you just described. To be instant with the Lord, yes. But how does that, what does that time frame look like? Is it, instantaneous for me, and yet a millennia for the rest of the people that come after me, or what?
I should have mentioned I also, for years, have really looked forward to the new body.
Yeah.
It's been that great.
Yeah.
So I look forward to that.
There's a lot of
Whatever
comfort in
form
that.
it takes.
I'll read a discussion question with y'all, or for y'all, and just hear me out. T.Wright notices that people tend to say conservative things at a graveside. They stick to what they were told when they were young. How have you seen this? And I went to a funeral just this week, and heard those words of comfort we say, and the message spoke of Wayne going on and being in glory with God right then and there. Why do you think people who are not particularly devout or serious about faith say things at someone's passing that do not reflect what they seem to believe and live the rest of the time? So, say you're at a funeral service, a graveside service, and there is someone there who's come because they care about you, they care about your family, they want to be a source of comfort and care for you at that moment. But this whole Christian thing, they just haven't really figured that one out yet, and don't really have a belief system that you would call religious, and really the whole thing is just questionable to do. And yet they want to come forward and say some words of comfort, and they may say something like that. I'll give you an example in just a moment, but I just want to sort of hear y'all's reactions. Y'all, what do you think?
Well, I decided, I lost my husband says, they're trying to be kind and comfort me. Don't take anything personal. They're trying to comfort me, and that's all they know how to do.
Anyone else?
I think everybody maybe knows that coming up to you and saying, I'm sorry they're gone, it's a shame their life meant nothing and there's no tomorrow. It's not going to be comforting, even if I believe it.
Hope you got some good pictures.
There's some level.
Say that again.
Say it again, like that. So
That's a Hallmark card there.
But I'm thinking even they know that that's not a comfort. And
Yeah.
so they're parroting, they're parroting the norm for the things that would make you feel better. Obviously they care, or they wouldn't be there. They want you to feel better, so they're saying what seems to make people feel better.
And there are circumstances where I believe that you don't have to say anything, and that not saying anything means more than words. Just a hug and embrace, and I'm here for you, maybe even not even there, but just let them know that you're there. But you're not trying to say, well, I know what you're going through, because we really don't. It doesn't matter,
She's there for you.
The people that Shirley and are describing are like the folks who show up for Christmas and Easter. I mean, I guess it's better than nothing, but I don't know, what's the point?
The example I heard, I was watching an interview, this several years ago, there's a man who was a very, I guess, a devout atheist. He really just did not adhere to any belief at all, and was trying to live a good life and all this stuff. There's flies this time of year. And his kids were getting old enough that they finally figured out that, everyone dies at some point. We all have that moment of realizing we don't stay kids forever. Eventually we grow up, we grow older, and we pass on we pass away. And his son came to him really upset. Daddy, you're going to die. I'm going to die. We're all going to die someday. And his daddy, even though he was a devout atheist, said, "It's okay. We'll all be in heaven together. It's okay." And there is that desire, that need, I think, for that comfort that we do want to share in. Okay, so let's talk about the Christian beliefs. Resurrection, we all hold on to that near and dear. That is the heart of our faith. And John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four give a slightly different variation, or maybe some different facts to it, from one account to the other. And are you going to fly swatter? Thank you. Send someone to heaven pretty soon. Has anyone ever wondered, because I've heard people sort of quibble and argue that those variations are some sort of a proof that none of them were right, that none of them were correct. And yet, and maybe you can help me out with this, counselor, how do those variations maybe actually substantiate or reinforce the story of the resurrection as being, and you sort of talk about this, as maybe it does have a little bit more truth to it than people want to give it credit for sometimes? Eyewitness accounts. Tell me about eyewitness accounts.
Okay, they are one of the most unreliable sources of information. You might have heard the saying, you see something and there's one act and there'll be 2 points of view. That's not true. If there's 4 people there, there'll be 6 points of view, because the people most of the time can't even tell a story consistently over time. So if there were 4 accounts and they were all exactly the same, what I would say is, they got together, memorized their story, and just parroted back the exact same story. But the fact that it's slightly different almost leads more credence to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to interject real quick, I'll give you a chance to show it. And just to sort of verify what or just to sort of give another variation of that, what I was reading, I'm reading along the actual book that this is based on, Surprised by Hope, that he wrote. And he said if you asked, eyewitnesses, or you ask lawyers about what eyewitnesses say, it's kind of like what Sarah said, they're not all going to say the exact same thing, but you're going to know something actually happened. They may not verify the exact same order of events or something like that, but the fact that you have multiple eyewitnesses, despite varying stories, is proof that something happened of some sort. Does that sort of testimony? How does that add any truthfulness, perhaps, to the gospel accounts of the resurrection?
Maybe it proved it to the women. I don't know how it had an effect on the men.
Well, the women wouldn't have had any followers. Back then, you might have had,
Other women.
the men might have had people that followed them in their own, but women obviously had no followers at the time, so there was no power proven by having it come through a woman.
But anybody making up the story would say that women had anything to say about it. So we're making something up.
Right. Well, it was a man's world. I mean, it was a patriarchal society. Women had no power. They were basically seen more as property than fellow humans, for the most part. And so, if you had a conspiracy, hey, let's get together. Let's come up with the best story we can to tell about Jesus being resurrected. And it's kind of crazy. No one's ever done that before. But let's make up this story about tomb being rolled away and angels and lightning and all this stuff and centurions being struck down by out of shock basically and all this stuff. Now, who can we get that would make what characters can we throw in this story that would make it more believable? How about women? No one believes them anyway, right? So the fact that women are in the story sort of goes against any thought that there would be a conspiracy where they would make up the story, because you would not have, because he sort of talked about this, you would not have chosen women as witnesses, because they would not have been seen as trustworthy witnesses, or even worth listening to for the most part, unfortunately. And so that's just another way that we believe that the gospel account does have more truth to it. Has truth to it, is that the fact that there are women as witnesses, because they wouldn't have just been thrown in there as some sort of a false witness, because no one would have believed them anyway. The fact that they're in there sort of shows that perhaps they really were there. Not perhaps, if they really were there, had to have been there, because they wouldn't have been used otherwise, or they wouldn't have been in the story otherwise. So there's that. Let's see. Some people look at the resurrection this way. Jesus died, he was raised, and now we get to go to heaven. Wright suggests another way to see the resurrection. It is about a new bodily life in this world and for this world. God's new creation has begun. We've got a job to do. The resurrection empowers us to the new ways today. How might these two viewpoints send believers to quite different directions in their daily lives? And I think the point he's trying to get to in his book that resonates with me is that how we perceive death greatly affects how we live life. How we perceive death affects how we live our lives. So there's two viewpoints that are out there. One is I get my get out of hell jail free. Get my get out of hell free card, and I get to go straight to heaven, and that's my reward for being a good Christian on this earth. Or resurrection is an ongoing process that involves me participating in the world to bring about the new creation, the new kingdom we sort of spoke a little bit about last week. How will that affect how a person acts? I'm talking about you personally, perhaps, even though you are going to think about that, I know. But how does that affect how you might live your life right here and now, or anyone might live their life, depending on which one they sort of adhere to?
I prefer A. There's a lot more hope in that and not as much responsibility.
Okay.
It seems like what the Right Reverend Wright was providing was, it's one thing to think that I've got a relationship with God and accept the forgiveness of Jesus and I'm going to get to go to heaven. I like that version. The idea that this is heaven and I'm expected to contribute accordingly is there's more responsibility there. It goes beyond a relationship and belief. It goes to my feet and hands.
Anyone else? Yes, Peggy.
No matter what we believe, He'll take care of it.
Agreed, absolutely. And I don't think he's looking for us to have, I don't think we get a quiz when we show up to see if we got the right answers. It's like, no,
He
we sort
has
of,
the answers.
yeah, he has the answers. And I mean, honestly, our beliefs are probably not perfect, and there's this, probably when we got a gazillion different denominations and how, they all have slightly variations of the same truth, but, slightly different perspectives on it. So it's not so much that we got it right or not. But I think it has to do with how we live. There's two words I sort of clung to when I was going through school several years ago. Orthodoxy, and orthopraxy. Now y'all know what orthodox means?
No.
It literally means right belief. Right belief. Being an Orthodox Jew, an Orthodox Christian, Orthodox whatever you want to say, means that you have right beliefs and you're saying you got the right theology, the right ideology, whatever it is. Orthopraxy is right practice. It actually means how you live your life. And I think that the two should go together, but they don't always. I know we've all known and been guilty of, at least myself, is I think I've got a pretty good theology. I got a pretty solid belief system. I can back it up and vouch it and all that good stuff. But I've always lived the right way. And there's a difference. There's also people who live really good lives, but they may be a little muddled on what the beliefs are, where they always come from. But I always wonder, well, how much does that take into account? How much does God take that into account how you live your life? For me personally, I'm not sure, exactly what happens when we die. But I do know, at least for me, my faith is to lead me to live a better life here, which means participating in God's creation, by trying to be a contributor, by trying to be a helper, trying to be someone who makes the world a little bit better than it was when I got here, whatever way that may be. And we all have our own gifts and talents for that. But I think how you live may, I think, Charlene, you put it really well, may affect how you see the world and your purpose in it. If your only reason to have a faith is so you can get to heaven, and what you do here isn't really that important, orthodox is more important than orthopraxy, then, it's not that you're not a good person, but you may not be as compelled to contribute, or improve, or bring about God's new creation, new kingdom. If you hold on to the belief that you are part of the resurrection right now, and the resurrection is going on all around us, then I think you'd be more inclined to live a life that has a little more orthopraxy in it, living a life that's sort of worthy of those beliefs. Probably not saying that very well, I feel like one of those, just like you said, the disciples, that were trying to describe something they didn't quite have words for, but that's sort of what I'm trying to do. Does that sort of resonate with anybody, or you want to disagree with me? You're more than welcome to do that too. Yes, Sherry.
He said the new world is right, the resurrection, he said the new world has begun. I don't think we tend to look at it that way.
Yeah.
I think we tend to look at this coming back as the new world.
Yes.
No.
As a future event we're looking forward to. Absolutely. I think that's exactly what we do. And I think the world sort of reinforces that all the time. I mean, again, you watch the news, you get on Facebook, you talk to friends and neighbors. How often is it like, things aren't as good as they used to be, Boy, things are so much worse now than they used to be. And we do sort of see this compounding of troubles over time, even though you look back historically, things have always we've always had wars, we've always had famines, we've always had, disasters of sorts. And in some ways, you go back very far, makes things seem a lot worse.
We haven't always had news like we get it now,
That's true.
and we hear it all.
We hear it all the time. It's hard to get away from it, actually. It really is. It's hard to get away from it. Even if you want to isolate yourself from all the bad news in the world, it's, you still see it in here. Wright declares that our calling is to be, and I quote, advanced foretaste of the new creation. So what is a practical way you can see to be God's advanced forecast in one of these places? So advanced foretaste. Advanced foretaste. So you're supposed to be a taste of what's to come, a taste of the world being a new creation. How can you be a little bit of that in your home? Any thoughts?
Where is that? I mean, that's from our liturgy. Foretaste of something to come. Isn't that a piece?
That's in the communion liturgy for Great Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Towards the end, we're talking about the resurrection and being a foretaste of the world to come. And we speak of Holy Communion as a foretaste of, the feast with heaven, the feast in heaven, with God. So that may be where you're. I can't quote it off the top of my head. Sorry, I should be able to. I can't. About midnight I will. About midnight I wake up and go, oh, it is.
Holler when you get it.
As you know, my phone goes off at 7 o'clock.
But if we are to be foretellers, forecasters, foretasters of this new creation, what would that look like in your home? It probably already does look like. Just give me an example.
Loving each other like we want to treat each other like we want to be treated. When there's people have hurts, illnesses, just be there.
Loving on our family members, being helpful, being healers, being teachers, being people of comfort, and living a life that makes a good example and stuff for our kids and our grandkids and such. Absolutely. What about a workplace? That's a tough place sometimes, isn't it?
We should be there every
Should be there everywhere. What about our community, which sort of brings up your homework question from last week? Did anyone drive around, look around, try to find places of need right here in our own backyard? Places that may seem like they could use a little foretaste of the kingdom come? Anybody?
I did. We need a better trash system or something.
Okay. So what did you
Well, I
see
say
with
that
y'all?
because I'm mowing, and down Highway 11, it's like they don't care where they are. It's out the window. And sometimes it's bags of trash. And then I'm on Facebook, and people are saying, the landfill won't take this and it won't take that. And I'm like, this is weird. So there's these people who are unable to clean what others are throwing out there. And so there was going to be something I would want to say, hey, can you help me with this? It's letting younger people know that they should be helping the elderly, whether it's mowing for them or picking up trash for them, getting their mail for them, just anything.
You can bring your trash over to my house because I just dump it on Frankie's yard.
Well, I burned
She's
mine.
not here to defend herself.
You didn't.
Kathy's not here.
She won't be here today, so you're safe.
Okay, good. I'm scared, Kathy.
Well, it's not even so much my little road,
Right.
because we're the cut-through road to Winsboro, so cans are out there incessant. It's a good way to make some money. If you ever want to just pick up aluminum cans.
All of this takeout food
Yes,
in town comes down my road. and
Yeah.
Throw it out.
I agree.
That was crazy.
One time, I picked up 14 beer boxes, big ones.
Or somebody would throw trash on the highway. Now, if I ever actually got away and get someone's license number, I think I would do it. I just had to.
Go right ahead.
I called the trash truck one time.
But we don't have trash, we have animals
And dropping off. Well, we had
abandoned, yeah, it was brought out and dumped, yeah, that's too.
I mean, if they don't want them, they should do away with them.
But
Not
because
make
I
them
live
law.
in a country, I can't see
I can't. Oh, I have to make a decision.
addresses our community.
So I'll share, okay, go ahead, Sharon.
We're really supposed to be looking for the human factor that is challenge.
Well, I think it's open to interpretation. I think, well, what y'all talking about is a human factor. Well, I don't see dogs and cats throwing trash out. I see people doing that all the time, though. And it makes me sick as well.
It does.
Yes, Jim.
I'm waiting for Charlene to raise her hand. To share an idea that she shared with me a few weeks ago, because I did think about this week and look around the community or whatever, and her idea kept coming back to me.
Charlotte.
Well,
Does she remember? Well, I think, and I mentioned it to you, Michael, the therapy animals. Just the idea where you see a lot more, you see a lot of therapy animals in use these days, and I know a lot of them are really, really trained, well-trained, and have to go through extensive training. But then there seems to be a level of therapy animals now that are not as strictly trained. And my question, I still don't have an answer. I've put some feelers out, but I haven't. I guess I was thinking, can we help somehow create a therapy animal training opportunities or be a part of that? We've got a place that they could be trained. We've got the need, the nursing homes. I don't know if y'all been up at the, I know many of you have, but you've been up to the the hospitals, the skilled care places in Tyler, and one of the things they do that just makes a huge difference with patients. You can see the minute they come in, they bring in their animals and the pets. That's a part of the therapy and a part of the healing process. We've got skilled care places, we've got hospital, we've got all these places that it seems like would be able to benefit from that, but we don't have the service.
It was just two kinds, and I can't remember what they're called, but there's the super trained ones and those dogs. The CASA group in Titus County has one there. You know, they take the dog to court, so kids who have to testify and are uncomfortable will have this dog. That dog cost $30,000, and the lady had to go for like a month and live with the dog to get trained. And then there's another, I don't want to call it a lower level, but less training, that might kind of be what you're talking about.
Actually, if you talk to my mom about it, because we had one at the center. We've used one of our staff went through the process before she got pregnant and stuff. Her dog was our therapy dog at the center.
Right.
And
So she has all that stuff.
And I talked to a friend this week also who's real involved. I think it's ASPCA or some variation, an animal place in Mineola, and told her about it. And she is supposedly going to find the certification and the requirements for us because she has all these animal world connections and stuff. Just for me, I'm going to cheat a little bit. This is actually a couple months ago that I saw this. As y'all know, I got a motorcycle a few months ago, and decided one Saturday afternoon to go tooling around, just to drive around Yanis. And I went down some country roads I'd always been curious about, what's at the end of that road, what's at the end of this road. And just went, just wandering around for an hour or two. And went down this little county road that turned into like a little dirt road, and there were no houses, no tree. I mean, there were trees. There was, no farms, anything. It was just very, very grown up. And you can tell there was probably very little traffic down this road because there were no houses on this road. And I come winding around this bend and see right up in the woods, shantytown. I mean, it was third world country, just big open kitchens, shacks, a few old campers, and that's where people were living. They had like this little, shack town just out in the middle of nowhere.
Have you been down my road?
Not yet, but I'm trying to get there.
He didn't say it was a home visit for one of us.
And then just sort of right around, this road just sort of took this big turn right there, this big bend. And there's a little bridge over a creek that fed into Lake Fork, and there were about 3 or 4 men there fishing. And I'm sure they're catching their supper. And it was kind of eye-opening because, I mean, I really felt like I had just like somehow driven through this this layer of our society that I have not seen in this area. I've seen it in other areas, but I've never seen it right here, just a few miles from where I live. And I knew those. I mean, I work with kids. I drive the bus. I see some pretty pitiful looking living conditions, but I had not seen anything quite like that there. And what I can do about that, what I can do about that is, I'm not sure. But it was definitely eye-opening when I saw it as, you know, a need in my community, that there might be some folks that are really living in desperation. That, you know, maybe they need something to get them out of that plight or whatever. And maybe they like living that way, but it's hard to imagine that being a very pleasant place to be in the winter or right now in the summer when it's so hot.
Well, across the road from me, I call them squatters. You know, maybe that's ugly, but it's kind of bad up there. I think they're cooking up meth. I've got a great imagination.
That
You
does
can
happen.
smell it.
That is a reality, though. It does happen too.
This
Yes.
week, I saw something, I tried really hard to do what our assignment was, but I live in Tyler, so it's different when I look out, so, and I'm not pretending it's the same, it's not. But something that, do you guys ever have one of those moments where you know something's going on in front of you, you just can't figure out what you just saw? I don't know if it's related to our lesson, but I was sitting there, I was working late one night and I got hungry, decided I couldn't live all of them past blessings, although we all know I could have. So I went across the road to this little restaurant and I sat down, and this guy had his back to me, this lady and man came in, and there's an older gentleman, and he sat down with his back to me, and he just solid white hair, obviously an elderly man. And then there was another family that came and sat right over there by him. Well, the family that came over, he had a Vietnam veteran cap on. His back was to me, I couldn't see anything but the Vietnam vet cap. And he walked over to the other elderly gentleman, and I heard him ask him if he had served, and he said something about the hat, so I guess the guy had something on his hat that identified him as a veteran. And then the Vietnam veteran guy said he had spent 3 years in Vietnam, but that didn't compare to what the older gentleman had done. And I was just sitting there, it just struck me that 3 years in Vietnam, this gentleman thought was nothing. I mean, I'm assuming the other gentleman was a World War II era vet, and I respect his opinion, but it just struck me that somebody who'd spent 3 years in Vietnam came back and still to this day thinks that's nothing.
There was a lady sitting next to Ed at the Walmart last night, and she started discussing her husband's life in the military. And she mentioned the forgotten war, the Korean conflict. And I thought that was so sad. And she mentioned the medals that he had won or deserved. And Ed was telling me about that on the way home.
And I think the VFW here closed again. I know that's not the same thing, but I just wonder if all those things together mean anything to anybody in terms of need.
I have a really good friend who's a Korean War veteran, and he was a Marine, and he's told me a lot of his Korean War vets, they kind of feel like like you said, they've been forgotten and overshadowed because, you know, World War II was such a monumentally huge war, and then Vietnam War was you know, broadcast every night on television. It got much more attention.
But it was so criticized.
It was. Oh yeah, I know.
It's
But
horrible.
you know, there was a lot more focus on it in the Korean War. You know, we knew troops went over, but it wasn't televised the way it was, the way Vietnam was. It didn't get quite the level of, you know, attention like you said. Sometimes there's a little bit of.
You know, Cheryl, like you were saying, I was in Vietnam, but I was just there for a year. And I still don't think it was anything like going to World War II. But when you were there until whenever, I knew I knew, and everybody that was there knew, well, if I make it through this year, I'm through. And I just, especially, I always knew about D-Day, but I didn't pay that much attention till this year when it was the 75th anniversary. I just can't believe the kids on the little landing craft things, going out there and just knowing, this is the end right here. You know, it was just different.
Is there any sort of need in the vet community that's not being met in terms of being able to be recognized, to meet, to do anything that we can do anything about?
Well, that's my wife's job. She's the, in Wood County and Kemp County, she's the Veteran Service Officer. And she works very hard getting veterans what they deserve. And she told me this week that there was a guy that came in, all kind of problems, he was a Vietnam veteran. And she asked him, well, how much disability do you get? He said, well, I get 10%. I have for hearing and diabetes. He said, I get 10% for one and 10% for the other, but I only get 10%. And she went through all this paperwork and stuff. And she found out that since 1990 something, or 2002 I think it was, that he was eligible for 20%, but he was getting only 10%. So she got all the paperwork done and pushed all the buttons and everything, and now they owe him another 10% every month from 2002. And he just couldn't, you know, it's $30,000, $40,000. So he just couldn't believe it. But that's what she does. She's very good at it.
Jim, you didn't get up earlier too. I'm so sorry. I think I passed over. Did you have something you want to say earlier also?
Oh, yeah, when they're talking about the trash and everything on the side of the road, I almost prefer when they don't mow the right of way. Because you really can't see it.
Yeah.
They go over and shred it all into pieces, and then it's everywhere.
If you've ever done, if has anyone ever done with the little highway pickups where you sponsor miles with a group, and we did that one day. We went out and picked up trash, and we get out there, oh, that's not so bad. And you get walking around, and you say there was trash like every foot. You know, there's a Coke can or a candy wrapper or some junk like that. All right, last but not least, the scriptures use living water as a metaphor for Christ being the source of life in a world that was dry and hot, dusty, and hard to survive in. And the metaphor, and the reason I think that that is used is because Christ as a living water is a source of life. It's a source of God's presence. How are we providing the living water right here in our dusty, dry neck of the woods? Of course, we're not talking about physically dusty and dry. But spiritually, we know what their numbers are. They're in any given, worship service or spiritual meeting of some sort, and then we know how many people live around us that, are not partaking, not sharing, maybe not even know about that living water. How are we acting as a source of refreshment, as a source of life, as a source of compassion and love for those who are thirsty? That was a good one. I think that was a good word for life. That's compassion in action up there. That's what's practicing, right? But what else are we doing? What else can we do? And that's sort of the purpose of this whole study, is to sort of take a good hard look at ourselves, reflect on what our role is, and see that it's more than just showing up and enjoying some hymns and coffee and occasionally when the preacher gets right a sermon. But also, is a place to sort of fill up our tanks so that we can take it out and share with the world around us. How are we living that out in our own lives, in our own community? That's just something for y'all to think about. You may not know the answer right off, but then again, you might. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Mark Twain's that every 3 months.
Those go good ways.
I think when I'm out and about and I see some elderly or someone that's incapable of doing some sort asked
Mhm.
to offer my help when I can. I feel good about that I've done that. I will share that Sherry and I, when we were out last week doing some shopping, there was a lady where we were at in a wheelchair. She was trying to buy food to eat for lunch. She couldn't maneuver everything, and Sherry helped put, again, we were there at the right time, I think. And I think sometimes that's, there was a lady at the dollar store the other day. She had to share that she was 90 years old by herself. I said, how are you going to get all of this out there? I mean, I'm not putting and patting myself for doing, but the need was there. And helping her, and I says, now, are you going to be able to get this home after helping her get it in the car? She said, I can do it. But again, when there's a need and you see it, offer.
Being aware, and I think just looking, keeping our eyes open and our ears pricked.
I think what we try to do at the prison is show the men out there that are not Christians, who do not believe, have never surrendered their life, that they do have access to that living God through what we bring out there to them, the information and the caring that we show those guys. Because they think society has just absolutely turned its back on them.
And they know if there's their first time or they've been behind bars before, or they've gone back whatever, they know the stigma
Yeah,
that comes with having that label ex-con.
absolutely.
And there's automatically people are defensive, distrustful, afraid because of something they've done.
And they are amazed and astonished that people will take time out of their own life with expecting no pay because they want to come out there and to visit with them, share the gospel with them, and say, we love you, you do matter, and we're here for you if we can help you learn to live a better life. And it's hard for them to grasp that. So often it's, you see a lot out there that really touches you deep.
With my daughter out there now, she shares stories because she is the first person that they see when they come in. She checks them into the units. And she said that it's heartbreaking, but to see those that have come back, that's even more so.
Those are called reboots. Reboots.
And the work y'all do with CASA, I think, for kids is so direly needed. I think that's another way of sharing that, finding justice for these kids. I mean, it's not all about handing out and picking up. Sometimes it's also about, making sure things are done right and justice is something served. And then finding places of safety and care for those who need it most and are most defenseless. And those are another ways that I just sort of know offhand. And I know what I've heard from day one about this place is, when there's someone needs something, those folks show up and they step up. So I think, just looking for those opportunities and then showing up and stepping up. Goes a long way.
We were speaking a while ago about the veterans. How often, and I do this whenever I see a veteran in uniform and I know, or if a guy has got a cap on, it says that, just go up and shake their hands and say thank you for your service. How much that means to them.
I'll tell you something, if you see somebody with a veteran's hat and it's a Vietnam veteran, what we prefer, because we didn't get it at the time, was instead of thank you for your service, it's welcome home.
Oh, that's a good one. That is a good one.
Yeah, 'cause a lot of those veterans were just almost attacked when they showed up.
Yeah, They told us, you know, if you have civilian clothes to wear on your flight home, and who has civilian clothes when they've been in the jungle for a year, but to wear them because it's going to be ugly at the airport. And that bothered me a whole lot at first, especially like Afghanistan and those vets coming home and people would be at the airport waving flags and everything, and we were getting spit on and yelled at. I mean, I got over it, but it did bother me for a long time.
Happened, it should.
Yeah.
Just doing your duty. Folks, that's about the time we have. We've got about 15 minutes to worship, so I'd like to close in a word of prayer. Would anybody like to pray us out, or I can if no one wants to? Gracious God, I just thank you for this day. I thank you for this group. Lord, I thank you for the study that we've shared and the discussion and the thoughts and reflection. Lord, I just ask that you give us insight and you give us direction. We are your people. We are people who hold on to faith in the resurrection, faith in life to come, faith that you are the living water in our lives, and faith, Lord, that this church is a source of living water for the world around us. Gracious God, I just ask that you give us direction in how it is that we share that, how it is that we give water to those who are thirsty, how it is that we quench that need that is all around us to know you better. Gracious God, just lead us in these coming months, years, to be the church that you would mold us to be. We follow you purely. Lord, it's in your name that we pray.